Good evening and welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us for tonight's talk, Tales from a Remote Island Expedition with Drs. Ezequiel Ezcurra and Sula Vanderplank. We're thrilled to see so many nature lovers joining us online. I'm Judy Gradwell, President and CEO of the San Diego Natural History Museum, and our building in Balboa Park is closed for the time being. However, our work to research, preserve, and share the natural history of our amazing region continues. And the tickets you purchased tonight, the donations, and the Facebook shares all help to support that work. Right now, we have a special opportunity to stretch your support even further. If you make a donation before August 31st, local philanthropists will match it dollar for dollar, doubling the value of your gift. And one of our elves behind the scenes is going to load the link for giving into our chat page now. We thank you for helping us keep our mission alive while our doors are closed. We're looking forward to reopening, and until that time, we will continue to bring natural history to you in your home. If you enjoy learning about research and conservation projects in Baja California, you won't want to miss our next lecture. Next Tuesday, same time, different link, August 25th, museum herpetologists Brad Hollingsworth and Frank Santana will discuss a binational effort to relocate red-legged frogs from Baja California to Southern California. I was witness to the big moment of the egg's arrival and can attest that it was a nail-biter of an adventure between the inclement weather, the advancing coronavirus, and threats of a border closure. But of course, the real work took years of study and preparation, and it's a fascinating and unusually upbeat conservation story. On September 1st, we'll host our Mexican colleagues, Ani Peralta Garcia and Jorge Valdez Villavicencio from the Baja California-based conservation organization Fauno. Ani and Jorge will share the story from their point of view with the entire presentation in Spanish. In order to stay up to date on online programming, including live trivia games every Friday night at 7 p.m. through August, follow us on Instagram at the handle @SDNHM and on the Facebook page for the San Diego Natural History Museum. Our website also has digital resources for families and students, and you can visit the Education tab to see those. We'll get started with tonight's program in just a moment. We're not anticipating any technical difficulties unless of course, there are power outages due to this heat wave. Please don't hesitate to ask for help in the Q&A box if you need any assistance. You can also use the Q&A box to post questions for the speakers. After Sula's talk is finished, she and Ezequiel will answer some of the audience questions, so please submit those as they occur to you. The earlier you get them in, and the more likely they are to be answered. And you can also use the thumbs up button to upvote your favorite questions from other audience members. Please also keep an eye on the chat box for useful links and resources from our team. And I've saved the best news for last. If you are unfamiliar with the webinar format, your camera and microphone are disabled, so you're free to watch this talk in your pajamas. The 2019-2020 season of Nat Talks is made possible by presenting sponsor, the Downing Family Foundation, and media partner KPBS, the public media stations serving San Diego and Imperial counties. Research expeditions have been an important field component of the museum since our founding nearly 150 years ago. Our region of interest and expertise spans both sides of the border and stretches through the entire length of the Baja Peninsula. And as we'll hear tonight, also to the islands in the Gulf and the Pacific. We are privileged to work with Mexican colleagues and students on these truly binational expeditions. The research yields fascinating and important science and provides valuable opportunities to connect with colleagues and to help train the next generation of Mexico's scientists and conservationists. Last week, our Nat Talk was a Spanish language panel discussion about the implications of the Revillagigedos research. This panel was co-organized by both of tonight's speakers, Dr. Sula Vanderplank and her colleague and major professor, Dr. Ezequiel Ezcurra. Before Sula comes on tonight to discuss the expedition, Ezequiel will briefly share some of the highlights of last week's conversation. Dr. Ezcurra has devoted his career to the study of ecosystems of northwestern Mexico. a fellow of the Ecological Society of America and corresponding fellow of the Mexican Academy of Sciences. He has published more than 300 papers and books. He was the director of the Biodiversity Research Center of the Californias here at the San Diego Natural History Museum, and has developed 2 museum exhibits and the award-winning film Ocean Oasis about the Gulf of California. He remains a valued advisor and partner on our binational research. He was honored, his honors go on forever. I'm just going to list a few. He was honored with a Conservation Biology Award and a Pew Fellowship in Marine Conservation. He was scientific chair of the CITES Convention, president of Mexico's National Institute of Ecology, and 11-year director of the University of California Institute for Mexico in the United States, UC-Mexis. Currently, he is a professor of ecology at the University of California, Riverside. Welcome, Ezequiel.
Thank you, Dr. Gradwell. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this. I really have a huge respect, I would say, a love for the Natural History Museum, and it's always wonderful to be able to participate in all the initiatives and things that the museum does. For over 100 years, for over a century, the museum has been an immensely important institution, perhaps the most important institution in cross-border dialogue between Mexico and the United States in natural history, exploration, and conservation. And it's really an honor and a privilege to be here. Last week, we invited some very high-level Mexican officers to discuss with us the importance of the Revillagigedos Island. It was in a gesture that I really appreciate and acknowledge from the museum. The whole meeting was done in Spanish. We had a large number of American participants suffering a little, but being patient and following what our main researchers and governmental officers had to say with respect to the conservation of these remote oceanic islands, these wonderful remote oceanic islands that Mexico has. But before giving you my own reasons why this research in remote islands is important, let me read you this paragraph written in October the 8th, 1835, by a very young, a 26-year-old young scientist by the name of Charles Darwin, in the Galapagos Islands. He wrote in his diary, "The natural history of these islands is eminently curious and well deserves attention. Most of the species are native, found nowhere else. There is even a difference between the inhabitants of the different islands, yet all show a marked relationship to those of America, though separated from that continent by an open space of ocean, 506 to 600 miles in width. The archipelago is a little world in itself, or rather a satellite attached to America, whence it has derived a few stray colonists and has received the general character of its indigenous productions. Considering the small size of these islands, we feel the more astonished at the number of their native species and at their confined range. Seeing every height crowned with its crater and the boundaries of most of the lava streams still distinct, we are led to believe that within a period geologically recent, the unbroken ocean was here spread out. Hence, both in space and time, we seem to be brought somewhat near to that great fact, that mystery of mysteries, the first appearance of new beings on this earth." I found very few short texts that summarize in such a powerful, I would call it almost emotional way, what Darwin called that mystery of mysteries, which is how do living organisms move around and colonize new environment, what he called the first appearance of new beings on Earth, and how they become endemic, they change in isolation, to become species only belonging to that little microcosm of the island. Darwin realized that the study of the Galapagos Islands was fundamental to understand the evolution of life on Earth. You could even argue that if Darwin had not visited the Galapagos, perhaps it would have been more difficult for him to arrive to the syntheses that he did on the origin of species and the theory of evolution. He was not the only one to be fascinated, I would call mesmerized, by islands and life evolving in isolation. Alfred Russel Wallace, shortly after Darwin's visit to the Galapagos, did similar studies in the archipelagos of Southeast Asia and reached similar conclusions to Darwin, which they published jointly in the Royal Society. Novelists like Daniel Defoe or Jack London or William Golding have been also inspired by islands and have organized a lot of their fantasies and arguments and narratives around islands. Thor Heyerdahl became fascinated by the evolution of human beings in isolated islands. And in the mid-20th century, in the 1960s, two of the greatest ecologists of last century, and one of them still alive of this century, Robert MacArthur and Edward O. Wilson, wrote a fascinating book called The Theory of Island Biogeography that used islands as, I would say, a metaphor of life in isolation. And the theory of island biogeography has been one of the most powerful ecological theories for the management of protected areas around the world, including islands, but not only islands. Our museum, the San Diego Natural History Museum, has a rich history in island exploration since the 1930s. Even before that, since the beginning of the 20th century, the museum has been exploring islands both in the United States off the coast of California, and especially in Mexico, and in particular in the Gulf of California. One particularly important person was Reed Moran, our botanist until 20 something years ago, our curator of botany, who spent large amounts of time alone botanizing and collecting plants in the remote island Guadalupe and Socorro in the Revillagigedos. His effort to protect the islands is so inspiring that Jane Goodall included a brief synthesis of Reed Moran's life, island efforts for conservation and work in his book, Reasons for Hope. She found in the work of the Natural History Museum, and in particular in Reed Moran's effort to protect islands, reasons for hope in a well-preserved and a sustainable world. Today, we're gonna add a little brick to that effort, to that construction that the museum is doing on our knowledge of islands. A couple of years ago, Sula Vanderplank, using the museum as its nurse institution, organized a trip to the Revillagigedo Island. She herself raised the money, she tortured the donors to get the funds, she organized the trip, she got the boat, and she organized this glorious expedition that you're going to hear about. Sula has played an immensely important role in our binational dialogue for years, and she still is. She now works for Pro Natura Noroeste Conservation Group in Mexico. And some of her contributions scientifically are seminal. Her efforts to understand the boundaries between the Baja deserts and the California floristic province and the evolution of those large biomes are incredibly important and cited papers. She has spent months riding mules in the mountains of Baja and working with ranchers to understand the sky islands and the montane vegetation in Mexico. And more recently, she has tortured every single sport fishing boat to get a free ride into different islands in Mexico. And she has compiled one of the most amazing databases on island biota in the Pacific Ocean. So this is all I wanted to say. Let me now transfer you to Sula Vanderplank. Sit back and enjoy, because she organized an amazing expedition, and that's what she's going to report on.
Thank you, Ezequiel. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here. As you may have gathered, I'm going to talk to you this evening about the Revillagigedos archipelago. Let me see. So the Revillagigedos archipelago is sometimes known as Mexico's mini Galapagos. So Ezequiel's introductory comments are particularly appropriate. And really, as much as this could be a more scientific lecture, I just wanted to share with you some of the amazing plants and animals that we witnessed. And really, I'm going to give you a travelogue style walk through some of these islands today, tell you about our expedition, about daily life, and show you some of the amazing things that we saw. So luckily, Ezequiel has explained to you the importance of this research on remote islands, but I wanted to put into context why these islands, why were we so desperate to go to these island groups? So I work primarily with plants, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the floristic island work that we've already done, that is working with island floras in northwestern Mexico. So why did we need to go all the way here into this orange circle to visit islands? Well, we actually already have really strong checklists for all these other island areas. So up at the top there, our California Channel Islands are very well botanized, as you know. Ezequiel and myself and John Redmond from the Natural History Museum have worked extensively on the Pacific Islands. In the Gulf there, my academic brother, Ben Wilder, has published a flora, and Ezequiel himself worked heavily on the flora of that lower red circle down in the Tres Marias Islands. So you can see this was kind of a natural next step for us if we want to understand distributions of plants between islands in northwestern Mexico. This was kind of a big missing hole in our knowledge. And I just want to make reference to talks that you'll be hearing in future. Last year, we actually also did a major expedition into this large pink circle here in the southern Gulf of California. And so we're now working to fill that hole in our knowledge. And the last hole in our knowledge will be this small area around Magdalena Bay, which some researchers in La Paz are actually also working on. Okay, so the trip I'm going to tell you about today, I'm really talking on behalf of a number of people who took part in this expedition, and everybody made unique contributions. We had scientists from many different disciplines, and I'll try to give you some insights into all of the different things that were studied during the expedition. But I've also willfully plagiarized a lot of their pictures and their information and their data. And you can read all about this in the report. I know there's a link to it in the chat box, and there's also a link at the end of this presentation. Please do download the PDF, check out the report, read about their great work. But everyone pictured here made significant contributions during the expedition. So I do love to work on places that require going on sports fishing boats. So to reach these remote islands, it was a 21-day expedition. So we needed a sizable vessel. And so we got the Shogun. The Shogun weighs about 100 tons, it's 98 feet long, and it has 14 different staterooms or bedrooms. So we took 2 people per room, 28 people on this expedition, plus this fantastic crew that you see pictured across the top. So we put our lives in their hands. And I want to acknowledge how well they took care of us. We really appreciate it. And this expedition was in February of 2017. So it did take us a couple of years to pull this report together. But one thing I wanted to mention about the Shogun in particular, in the past, when the museum did an expedition to Guadalupe Island, they actually strapped a helicopter to the back of the boat to access some of the remote outer islets and remote parts of Guadalupe Island. So we knew the Shogun was a great vessel. The other thing that we knew about the Shogun is that their food is terrific and their chefs are amazing. Normally when we're in the field, we suffer, you know, and we live on beans and tortillas for weeks, and we cook in the fire, and, you know, life is hard. But no, it was 3-course meals on the Shogun. So we were well fed for 21 days, and I dare say we all came back a little heavy. I really do want to acknowledge Ezequiel, because apart from being my own inspiration, he is also a permit wizard, and he had to deal with 4 different branches of Mexican government to get the permits to make this expedition happen, and it would not have been possible without him. So thank you, Ezequiel. This is our trip map. You can see we started in San Diego. We worked our way down the peninsula, and it actually took 3 days to get to the islands by boat. So we made a couple of quick stops on the way down, more than anything to stretch our legs, and because it's impossible to keep 28 scientists cooped up on a boat for 21 days. You have to let them off every now and then. So we made a couple of pit stops, and I'll talk in particular about that first stop where it says San Roque Island. Then we headed down to the islands, and I'm actually going to talk about them in reverse order today. I'm going to talk about Clarion, which is this furthest island off. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse actually, but so this island first, off to the west here. And then Socorro and San Benedicto are closer together. Then we came back to Cabo San Lucas and we flew home and let the boat come back up against the current in rather difficult weather conditions, which we were glad to avoid. We made this brief stop on these two tiny islands, San Roque and Asuncion, that first stop sort of halfway down the peninsula here. As I mentioned, this was really just a leg stretch. But you can't go anywhere with scientists without making new discoveries. And so amazingly, we managed to double the known flora, the number of plants on both islands. So there were 4 plants formally reported from San Roque and 6 formally reported from Asuncion. And in both cases, we were able to double that number. Now, in some cases, this is because non-native plants are arriving, but actually in these cases, we found new native plants too. And so you can see here pictured 2 of the sort of showier plants that we found, despite the tiny size of these islands. There were also some ground nesting birds that are pretty special. And so you'll see for birds an IUCN status. That's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they maintain a worldwide list of species and their conservation status. And so VU is vulnerable. So there were species listed as vulnerable internationally, and NT is near threatened. So there's really good success stories to find these sort of rare birds on these islands. We also were joined by our marine mammal expert, cetacean expert, Diane Alps, and she put together some photo ID catalogs for the different marine mammals that we saw. And she made some pretty interesting discoveries. So there were these sea lions on San Roque, this big rookery, and that was interesting. But then she found harbor seals on San Roque, and this turned out to be the furthest south they've been documented on the Pacific coast. So even on the first day of this expedition, before we got to the islands, we had some pretty exciting new records. During the crossing too, we also had pilot whales, and she studied the whales and dolphins throughout our expedition and got some fantastic pictures and some really interesting data. So it was nice to have a marine component to our mainly terrestrial expedition. Now we made that second stop near Magdalena Bay, and I am showing you this picture to shock you a bit. So this is the area that I mentioned at the beginning. We really need to return and do some more floristic work. It's a contentious area to visit right now, and conservation-wise, there's some big push and pull between the conservation community, the fishing community, and the military base on Margarita Island there. So we were pretty shocked to see a lot of sharks being caught. We were told that these were all being shipped to Mexico City as bacalao. But this was certainly an interesting stop on our journey, if not the most fruitful scientifically. It was really just a couple of hours again to stretch our legs as we made our way south. One of the other really cool things about the expedition for me was to travel with John LaGrange, who was our resident shell expert or malacologist. And he was able to study the shells that we found on the beaches from this trip. So this was by no means an exhaustive inventory, but he put together really interesting documentation of the shells that we found on each of the stops. And this expedition actually transited 4 different provinces of mollusks. And so we got shells from 4 different sort of ecological provinces in the marine world. So from California down to the Panamics, down to the Indo-Pacific province, and into the Caribbean province. So a really wide variety of shells. And that was a pretty special addition. You can read about that in the report. So the Revillagigedos Islands are indeed a UNESCO World Heritage Site of patrimony for the world, considered particularly important, but mostly they were designated because of their marine life. They're mostly famous for their marine life, and you can see here these beautiful pictures of the seamount here. This is Roca Partida, and you can see the fish swimming around underneath. It's an important dive site. It's been very famous for its marine life, but we were mostly here for its terrestrial life. But just again to remind you, these are the islands. This is the park. You can see that the park itself, the marine protected area, is huge and includes a really large area of ocean around these islands. And again, that's Clarion off to the west by itself. Roca Partida, I'm going to say it's not an island because strictly speaking, to be an island, you have to have soil and plants. Therefore, it's a rock. So I'm going to say there's only 3 islands in this archipelago, although you'll often hear it referred to as 4 because a lot of people consider Roca Partida to be an island. In the middle there, and then Socorro and San Benedicto off to the east. Okay, so I'm going to start with Clarion because it's the most remote, and this is Tales from a Remote Island. So Clarion Island is really far out there. Here's just a few stats on the island itself. So it's almost 20 square kilometers in area, or if you'd rather, about 7.5 square miles. So it's a small island. And the peak in the middle there is 335 meters, or about 1,000 feet high. So it's a small island, not particularly high, and it's actually 436 miles from the shore and almost 200 miles from the nearest island. So the nearest island to it is Socorro Island, which we'll go to next, which is the largest in the archipelago. But you'd still have to travel 200 miles to get to the nearest landmass. So it's pretty amazing to think that all the species we find here naturally have traveled all that way. Now, this island was first discovered in 1542. It didn't have any indigenous inhabitants. The Mexican Navy did set up a garrison on the island in 1979. And at that time, some non-native animals were introduced. Now, originally, this was as a food source, and they were contained in a small area of the island, but inevitably, over time, they escaped, hurricanes knocked the fences down, things happened. And so there have been problems with non-native animals on the island since about 1979, and pigs were later introduced in 1991. And we'll talk a little more about how that upset the natural balance of the ecosystems out here. I wanted to show you just some of the landscapes here. Here are some different views of the island, just trying to give you a sense of place. You can see here the beaches. There is this sort of seasonal freshwater lagoon on the shore there. And amazingly, we saw sort of ducks and water birds that had stopped in for a visit. And some pretty unusual birds in that part of the island. I'm going to show you two images from Google Earth, and this is literally just using the Google Earth time slider just so we can see a comparison. But when non-native species were removed from the island, and they're not all removed, but a lot of those, the pigs and the sheep and so on, were removed by the Mexican government and island conservation group very successfully. When these were removed, the vegetation really started to recover. And so I want to show you one picture from 2007 and one 10 years later from 2017. I'd like you to just try and look at the change in shrub cover. Now, it's a bit difficult because they're from different seasons and you're going to see a difference in greenness. But if you pick a part of the island, like let's say you pick a corner here, look at how dense the vegetation appears. Then we'll go to 2017. You can really see how that's filled out. Let me go back, show you again. Try not to focus on the green, just the darker vegetation. You can really see a huge increase in vegetation cover on the island. So this is a really exciting place for us to go and study. Imagine these non-native animals have been removed, this flora is rebounded, and we get to go and try to learn more about what's happened as part of that process. So the flora for this island, actually Ezekiel in his introduction mentioned Reed Moran, who was the former botanist at the Natural History Museum, and we had the honor of going back with Dr. John Redman, who is the current curator of botany at the museum. But Reed Moran published the flora of this island and Socorro Island in 1989 and included a reference to this 1931 publication from Johnston, but Moran never made it to Clarion, only Socorro. So he made it to this archipelago, but not this island. But so that prior plant list was 42 plants. So we understood 42 different plants to grow on Clarion Island. And of all of those, only one was not naturally occurring on the island and had been introduced by humans, which was pretty impressive. And there were 4 plants here that were found nowhere else in the world, endemic to just this one island, not even the other islands. So that's pretty impressive for such a small island so far offshore, that 4 different species evolved here completely for the flora. Well, when we went back in 2017, we actually found 16 new species of plants on the island. So we now have a total of 58. Why is this important? If we want to understand how to conserve this island, we need to know the species that are there. So it's particularly exciting to know that there's actually closer to 60 different plants growing on this island. But now we're dealing with 11 that don't belong here. 11 that are non-native, that have been brought by humans. They're not naturally occurring here and that are not in balance with the ecosystem, didn't evolve in place, and are aggressive. So we've got 11 species to be concerned about eradicating, and 41 that we need to be really concerned with that are native. No, I'm sorry, 58 native species and 11 non-native. So 58 species to be concerned with, and 4 of those in particular that are found nowhere else in the world and are the highest conservation targets. So we found 3 of those 4 endemics. We weren't able to visit all of the island, and we weren't able to cover the whole area. Although it might sound small, it's actually still quite a lot of hiking. These are 3 of the 4 plants that you can't see anywhere else in the world. So I wanted to share these with you. These don't actually have common names because they're not in common usage by people. But you can see here, this is a physalis in the potato family, this teucrium here, and then a grass, the Ceristida at the bottom. So these are 3 of the 4. The 4th one, we were not able to relocate. It was a morning glory of sort, an Ipomea. We've since heard from other people working on the island that they have found it and that it is still there and it isn't extinct and we don't have to worry. It's there on the northern end of the island in areas that we didn't reach. But that's the 4th. One really exciting thing that we did find is a potential 5th endemic for the island, and it looks like a new species to science in this group of plants that we call the Dutchman's pipes. And you can see why we call it a Dutchman's pipe from the form of this flower with that big brown sort of pipe-like appearance. Now it's brown because it's pollinated by flies and it tries to look like rotting meat and not always smell so good. And you can see they actually have these beautiful fruits. If you look in that top right corner, there's a green seed pod that's just developing, getting ready to open. So interestingly, there's a Dutchman's pipe on the nearest large island of Socorro, which don't forget is almost 200 miles away. But this one actually looks pretty different. So this is the one on Socorro. And this one is unique to Socorro and not found anywhere else in the world but that one island. And it's named after the island, Aristolochia socorrensis. So I'll just go back so you can compare the flowers again, but look how straight this flower is and look at the coloration on the inside of the petals there. You see it's really different. Look at the hairiness on this one and that bend in the flower. And some differences in the leaves there too. That's pretty exciting. So it looks like we have a new species to science from this tiny remote island, and it would certainly be a high conservation priority. But it's going to take a lot more work to really describe that species and be able to give it a name and tell the world something about it, which is why we need to go again. The island is also covered in burrowing owls, and so here I am climbing around looking for plants, and what do I find but somebody staring back at me? You can see here, this is the Clarion Island burrowing owl, and I put the plant names in too, just for my botanical friends who appreciate that that's not what I was looking for climbing around in the bushes. But these guys were all over the island and actually really friendly, really nice to see this little endemic burrowing owl. Food-wise, our bird team was kept very busy during this expedition too, and as I mentioned, I'm going to include those sort of rarity categories for some of the birds that they found. Our bird team was headed up by Jorge Montejo and Amy McAndrews, who did an amazing job recording birds. I don't think they slept. I swear before the sun came up every morning, they were at the front of the boat birding. And when we all went to bed every night, they were still birding. But some of the interesting things that they documented here included the white-necked petrel, which was some of the first records for all of Mexico for that species. And we also saw this bird in the middle here. This is a Nazca booby. And these are my favorite birds because the genus is Sula. And this is Sula grantii. It's not Sula Sula, it's a Sula Sula. We also saw Sula Sula. We had 4 different species of booby birds on our trip, which was really exciting. We had an entomology team as well that was studying the small invertebrates of the island. So I wanted to share a couple of the invertebrates that we had here. So there's a plant hopper down here in the right corner. That's kind of a sapsucker. This little beetle at the bottom here is actually a seed sucker. And this little, I think he's a wasp, the little invertebrate that you see here at the top is actually a parasite found on spiders on the island. So some really interesting discoveries from the insect world. And we had an ant expert with us, Ida Norton, studies ants, and she was able to collect all sorts of different species of ants on this expedition and work on a paper for ant biogeography out here. And she found a couple of really different species. And I love these pictures. You can see these close-ups of the faces. And if you look at that one at the top right, it's a particularly tiny ant. And there's a whole paper on ants and spiders of the islands in the report. The herpetology team was not to be left behind. That's the team that was studying reptiles and amphibians out here. And Clarion Island actually has its own snakes. It has a Clarion Island whipsnake pictured here. It also has a night snake, which we weren't fortunate enough to find during our expedition, which is certainly still present on the island. And we were assisted here by some members of the military from the military base on Clarion. And this is Ulysses here, who was helping me transect an area of the island that didn't have a clear path. And so he offered to guide us through part of that island. When we caught some of these snakes, we actually saw scars on their sides from where they were being attacked by the ravens. And there were times that the ravens seemed to be following us and almost trying to wait for us to find snakes and other interesting things that they could maybe try and swoop down on afterwards. So we had to be pretty careful to put these guys back safely where we'd found them. But also western spiny-tailed iguanas in abundance on the island. And so interestingly, when they're young, they're green, and as they get older, they're black. And, you know, at first we thought there were two different iguanas and what was going on. And, you know, as a botanist, I don't know one iguana from another, but it was very exciting. And so we were desperately trying to get the radios to work, to get in touch with our herpetologist to make sure he'd seen them too. Vince Scheidt was on the expedition as our herpetologist. And you can see there's some blood on the back of this iguana. That's not the iguana's blood. That's poor John's blood, because when he caught the iguana, it really bit him. These guys are ferocious. Now, it turns out they're not native to the island. These are introduced. And rumor has it that there was a lieutenant who was sick of the flies, and he brought these iguanas out to the island to eat the flies. But he didn't realize that they were vegetarian. And when they didn't eat any flies, he was disgusted and he threw them out, and they took over the whole island. And I have no idea if that legend is true, but it's a great story about how animals get introduced to islands. So these iguanas are now pretty rampant all over the island. And we don't really know anything about the ecological impact that they're having. We don't know what plants they're eating. We don't know how they might be affecting recruitment or endemic plants. So there's a lot of questions about what impact these non-native iguanas are having on Clarion Island. And here's a young one to show you the contrast. The herpetology team of reptiles also, of course, includes turtles. And I think one of the highlights for everybody was seeing these tiny baby turtles swimming around the boat at night and on the beach, and seeing turtles nesting. We certainly saw lots of turtles during the expedition. This is a green turtle pictured here with a morning glory growing on the beach. But these were just some really lovely moments from the expedition. I wanted to tell you a story about Clarion Island that really was completely serendipitous research for us. We were put in touch with two whale researchers, actually through Diane Alps, Jeff Jacobson and Aaron Falcone, and they had come out to study whales on Clarion Island in 1999. And the weather was so bad, they got trapped on the island and they couldn't do their research. Well, being the amazing scientists that they are, they weren't going to waste their precious time on this island, and they knew that things were changing with the removal of non-native animals. And so they set up transects and took sort of points monitoring the vegetation all over the island, knowing that one day somebody could come back and do a comparison and look at change through time. And so when we got in touch with them, they said, oh, we'll give you the data. You can go back and resurvey the same points. And so Dr. Dawn Lawson really led this charge. And she said, oh, you know, this is fantastic. Okay, I'll organize the teams and get everyone going. So this is their original map. They drew these evenly spaced lines along the island, and then they set up points, and they did all this monitoring all over the island. They were there a lot longer than us, and we really didn't have time to revisit all those plots, but we gave it our best shot. And so that's a comparison from 1999 to 2017, so we're 18 years on. And you can see here in this map, the solid dots are all the places that we were able to resample. So these are basically all the places within a one-day hike from our landing point, which was right in this large bay here, right below F40. So we anchored just below F40, we landed here. You can see we walked the middle of the island. We day tripped all the way out to the north end of the west end of the island. The east and north ends of the island remain somewhat unexplored by us. And so we weren't able to reassess the vegetation there, but certainly in these more transited areas and around the naval base, we were able to resample. So what changes did we see? I'm going to give you a really quick summary, just a couple of slides, but I think this is fascinating. We saw a lot of change in these vegetation plots over those 18 years. So there were 23 plants total. So these are just perennial plants, the longer lived plants that we could compare from one year to the next. There were 23 plants in the matrix, but only 15 were in common from 1999 to 2017. So a huge amount of change in these plots. There were 5 that we didn't find, that they found in 99 that we never found again, and 3 new ones that we had found that they hadn't. But perhaps the most interesting finding, if you take the average number of species in each plot, 1999, there were more than 4 species in each plot, and in 2017, there were just 3. This is a pretty significant drop in our average number of species per plot. And theoretically, we expected the opposite. We thought that the removal of non-native animals would lead to an increase in native species and more diversity and better conditions, and that the island would be thriving and there would be more species per plot. So this was a really surprising result. And I want to try and explain this to you really quickly with a couple of graphics. Stay with me. If you map in space what happened to each species through time, these are what the dots look like. So each dot represents a plot moving through time. And you can see the arrow indicates towards the modern day, towards 2017. So almost all the arrows basically move from the top left corner of the screen to the bottom right. Now, if we map the plants in the same space, you can see what's happening is a shift from a lot of these species in the middle down towards the species at the bottom, from these species at the top, like Eriocloa acuminata, remember that's our endemic grass. And then you see this Brachylia and Tribulus. These are sort of species that tend to come in more after disturbance and follow disturbance. Think about those non-native animals disturbing the island. But this plant down here, Cenchrus ciliaris, which is pulling all these species, that's buffalo grass, which is a really nasty invasive grass. And so what we're basically seeing is a lot of type conversion of these habitats being taken over by one of these invasives. So you remember I told you that we found more invasive plants on the island now? This is that buffalo grass covering the lower slopes of that island. And so what's happened in a lot of these plots is that instead of being a mixture of native species beforehand, however much they were impacted by these non-native animals, when the non-native animals were removed, it was the invasive plants that were more aggressive and the more aggressive competitors and that have taken over a lot of these lower slopes. Now you have to keep in mind, we only resampled areas that were in fairly close approximation to the naval base because we didn't have the time to walk to the further areas and access different parts of the island. So this is definitely a story from the areas that are slightly closer to that human occupation, to that naval base and to the landing area. But we're certainly now very worried about the impact that invasive plants are having on Clarion Island. And Dawn put together a vegetation map based on our findings and our plots. And you can see she left here in dark gray the areas that we weren't able to visit at all, or even see through binoculars and where we really don't have any data. And although, you know, between us all, we tried to spread out and cover as much ground as possible, we weren't able to include the whole island. But you can see here she indicates which areas are dominated by different species. And all these browner ones are completely dominated by buffalo grass. Okay, on to happier things. Around the boat at night, we saw a lot of sharks. The water around Clarion clearly has a lot of sharks, and these are what we were seeing around the boat, sort of in the boat lights at night. So personally, I did not swim. And now we're going to make the transition to the other islands. So I mentioned Roca Partida is not strictly speaking an island, but it is very beautiful. And so we did make a quick swing around Roca Partida and document the different birds that were flying around and take a look at that on our way to the big island of Socorro. Now we've transited about 200 miles to the east. We're on Socorro Island, and this is actually a view from the north end of the island. Now Socorro too has a history of some non-native animals, but a lot of times they didn't make it up all the way to the north end. So the north end, you can see the vegetation is very sort of pristine and intact. It was quite exciting, sort of clearing our paperwork at Socorro. It took a while, and eventually we made great friends with the lieutenant, and we were delighted when they offered us use of our vehicles, their vehicles, to move around the island. So we're very grateful to the Mexican Navy for their help and support. We really enjoyed visiting with them, getting to know them, spending some time on the island. And they have a lot larger presence on Socorro. There's a much larger naval base and much bigger outpost there. So the island itself, 600 kilometers offshore, as we mentioned earlier. It's about 51 square miles in area, so a lot bigger than Clarion. And the high peak is now close to 3,500 feet. So it's not just a much bigger island, but a lot higher. Sheep, cats, and rodents were introduced in the 1970s again. And Socorro Island is really almost a case study of what non-native predators can do to birds. Many of the bird populations on Socorro were heavily impacted by these species that can raid nests, kill birds. They actually drove the Socorro dove to extinction, although it has been saved in zoos or in other sites out ex situ conservation. It is protected in zoos, and so it's not completely extinct to the world, but it's extinct in the wild due to these non-native predators. And so there have been massive efforts by the Mexican government, excuse me, and the island conservation group HESI to eradicate a lot of these non-native animals, but you're still seeing that sort of footprint on the landscape again. So I'm going to show you this same Google Earth from 2007, 2017, and again you can see this massive increase in vegetation. So look at some of these lower slopes that are barren in 2007 and then really filling out in 2017. You can really see the shrub expansion and the recovery on the southern end of the island here. And so this is again a view from the northern end of the island. Socorro is beautiful. It's a beautiful island. There's a natural sea cave here, and you can see the beach that we landed on below. You can imagine how special it is to be there. And there were really interesting plants like this scaviola, and I've included this picture because it's the first time in my life I snorkeled, swam ashore with my snorkel, pulled out a plastic bag, made a plant collection, and swam back to shore. So for the plants and insects only, we did make scientific collections. And so we have pressed, dried specimens. We always leave a full set of these in Mexico, and we bring a set home to the San Diego Natural History Museum to be studied as part of the Flora of Baja California project. And so you can see that press in the background, that orange press. And so these were pressed and dried and added to our scientific collections, collected by snorkel. I put it on the label. Other really interesting plants. So this is a plant that's actually really widespread through the tropics. And fairly well known to a lot of people. I'm sure I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but the manchineel tree is highly toxic. And so it has this awful sap that if it gets in your eyes will really make your eyes swell up and be extremely painful. And I stole this picture off the internet, so I apologize for the stolen picture. I couldn't find a good one of my own. But I wanted to tell you about this plant in particular because it's one of those that's really widespread, but also very famous for, they say if you fall asleep under it, you'll go blind. And so there's definitely an advantage to knowing your plants and being a botanist, knowing what to watch out for. And we were really grateful to Tom Oberbauer on our trip who let us know in advance, this plant is out there, do not touch it. One of the coolest things for me, I didn't know before we went, is that Socorro has fumaroles. Just like Yellowstone, it has these volcanic vents and this fantastic stench of sulfur and these amazing hydrothermal vents at the very top of the island. And we would never have got here without the Mexican Navy's help. Would have been a serious backpack to get up here, but it was so wonderful to be able to visit these. And I always feel like you're kind of staring into the face of creation when you look into these thermal vents and you think about the bacteria that evolved here under these harsh conditions and you smell that sulfur. And this was a real wow factor for me. And you can see here there were boiling mud pots and the steam was coming straight out of the vents. And I'm sure we all got way too close. We tried really hard to stay away from them. But they also kind of draw you in. You can see these amazing landscapes. And here's John the Grange with a big chunk of sulfur from the top there. And then my complete amazement, at the top of the island, there's a little rainforest. As you go up in elevation and you reach that higher elevation at the peak, there's an area of rainforest at the top of Socorro, and it's full of trees that are full of epiphytes. I was just blown away, and you can see our curator of botany, John Redman, is blown away too. And we're looking at these mossy trunks and these peperomias and these other plants hanging there, and there were orchids in the mix, those beautiful orchids sitting on the tree branches. And suddenly we've gone from these shrublands of Socorro where every plant was below the waist to being in a canopy of forest trees at the top of the island. So this was just an amazing contrast. So within this archipelago, the contrast, the three islands are so different. The contrast is fantastic. For Socorro Island, not as many new records as you might think compared to Clarion. We did find 17 new records for the whole island. We spent a lot more time on Socorro. We were here for more days. The total flora of the island is estimated around 263 different plants, so much more diverse, much more complicated island, many more habitats, much more area, different elevations, and kind of the same number of new records. And I think that's in part because Socorro is far better studied, and in part because we went to the places with the best access, which are probably the same places that everyone else goes. So don't forget, Reed Moran had done this flora here in the 80s, I think it was 80, 81, whereas Clarion's flora hadn't really been revisited since about 1939. So we did make some significant contributions, but Socorro, being this large island, actually has 27 plants found nowhere else in the world. Wow. We did, of course, still find some invasive species and species that don't belong there. And this is one, actually a rather beautiful one, that was coming up around the naval base in particular. This is where the boats are landing. This is where things are coming ashore primarily and washing ashore. But these are mostly transported by humans and things that we need to eradicate and be aware of in the future. This is one. We did find some native new records. This fern actually was a new record for Socorro Island. It was growing right there behind the military base, along one of the roads. And the island is absolutely covered in these amazing blue lizards. And there's a paper in the report that Vince Scheidt wrote that really talks about their demographics and their spread on the island and estimated population size. But they're gorgeous. The island's covered in bright blue lizards. This is the Socorro blue lizard, found nowhere else in the world. Absolutely gorgeous. And I'm grateful to Jack Danes for a lot of these amazing images. Bird team was no less happy on this expedition. They are here taking pictures of the Socorro mockingbird, which I won't try and point out to you, but it's there, believe me, somewhere off in the distance. So that was listed as critically endangered on the IUCN list, and the population estimate is now somewhere between 190 and 280 individuals. So this is the only place in the world that bird is found. It's another bird that was heavily impacted by those non-native species. It is recovering. And thanks to the efforts of eradication, it is recovering and improving. And that was just a really exciting bird to find. Here's a picture of it from Jack. I know it looks like a little brown bird, but it's the Socorro mockingbird. There's just another few notes on the birds. There were a lot of amazing bird discoveries during the expedition. There were 111 birds in total documented during the trip, and 61 birds just on the Revillagigedos Islands. The recovery on Socorro of a lot of these bird populations really seemed to be absolutely excellent, and some Townsend's shearwaters were observed around there too. The other thing was this tropical parula, which is the bird pictured here, the Socorro parula, which is also a threatened species. And here's a picture of the Socorro wren. Socorro has a lot of endemism. Being such a large island and so far offshore, has a lot of unique species. It's a very special place. For new ant records too, none of these teams ever came up short. You know, every day we'd come back to the boat every night, we'd sit around, we'd go, what did you find today? Well, I found 3 new records today. Well, I found 5. Well, I found, you know, and it was fascinating to be part of a multidisciplinary expedition with people finding so many different things. These are some of the different ants from Socorro. If you take a look at this one in the top left corner, this all black ant with the very red legs. This was actually surprisingly rare here. Pretty scarce, but this is a new ant record for Socorro. This one in the bottom right hand corner was a lot more common, but really I just love this face. Look at the face of that ant. I had to take some fantastic pictures. Just a few other things found on the island. So the museum's arachnologist, Jim Berrien, was with us on this trip, and he did some amazing work on the spiders. You can see here a few of the different spiders that he found. There were a few other things, not just from entomology world, but also these Socorro green parakeets. And I'm personally a huge fan of the scorpions and these amazing beetles. There's just all sorts of discoveries being made every day. And now I'm going to take you to our third and final island, San Benedicto Island. had a major volcanic eruption in 1959 that covered almost the entire island in volcanic ash. And you can see it is covered in volcanic ash. And these are these kind of solidified ash deposits, and most of the island looks like this. And so it was particularly daunting landing and trying to get up on San Benedicto Island. It's got a total area of under 4 square miles, so it's the smallest of the 3. And its tallest peak, Barcena, reaches about 1,000 feet, which is about the same height as Clarion Island. So it's a lot smaller and steeper, but a similar total height to Clarion. I'm sorry, the last major eruption was 53, not 59, apologize. But this is a view from the top looking down at the Shogun. You can see our boat there off in the distance, this beautiful view from the top of the volcano. And so you see that there is some grass, there is something, San Benedicto Island, but wow, you wouldn't know it from the bottom. Looking up, it was like, wow, is there anything here? It's really amazing. And everything that you find has basically arrived since that eruption most of the time. So this was really special. You can see here the slot canyons that we had to kind of climb up to be able to get up to the top where that area that hadn't been completely inundated with ash at the top there. You can see we're helping each other climb up here. There's Peter Schuyler, and I can see Vince, and looks like Alan climbing up there. But we were basically all kind of white with this fine volcanic dust at the end of the day from climbing up through it. Here's another view from the top. You can see some of these offshore rocks and just these spectacular views. It was a really special place to be. And it had its own fair share of really amazing new records. So there was this tobacco plant. This is a tobacco, Nicotiana Stocktoniae. And we said, oh, there's the tobacco. You know, it must be that Clarion tobacco. But when we look a little more closely, discerning eye, we'll see, look at the length of the floral tube, the one on the right from Clarion compared to this one on San Benedicto. These actually look pretty different. I don't know if it's an entirely new species or just a new subspecies, but it looks like there's 2 distinct taxa. So this plant's reached that archipelago, but then it's evolved even further in situ, and we've got perhaps a different species on each island, or a different taxon on each island. So that was a really exciting discovery. And then we documented the euphorbia and had the same thing. Well, hang on Clarion, this euphorbia had white bracts, and now it's got red bracts. And so another potential new taxon. And again, is it a subspecies? Is it a variety? Is it a new species? We need more work. We need to know more to be able to really understand these differences, to name these new taxa. There's a lot left to be done. And I think for me, that's sort of one of the main messages from this expedition, is how much we have left to know about the natural world. And you know, as David Attenborough said recently, there's never been a more important time to learn about the natural world and how to protect it. And so I think these are examples of just how much there is left to know about life on these remote islands and all over the world. There was a lot of this grass at the top. This was probably the dominant plant on the islands. This grass is a 3-awned grass in the Aristida group. And nestled in that grass were a lot of birds getting ready to start nesting around here. So we had to be really careful. We certainly couldn't walk all over the place. There were a lot of different nesting birds down in there. There were some more booby birds that, you know, letting you know to stay away. And you can see this euphorbia is like a mat all over the ground up here. There were mating pairs of albatross. This is their pair bonding here. Pretty special place for birds. We also had red-billed tropic birds nesting up there on the top. So just a really special outpost for birds. And when we got there, the entomology team said, look, there's no entomological records for San Benedicto. Any insect you find, it's going to be a new record. And right as we're climbing up that volcano, something flies right up my nose. What's this? You know, and I pull out this wasp, and you know, about to sort of get rid of it as quickly as I can. I remember, any insect you find on San Benedicto, it's a new record. So I turned to my entomology team members, said, you want this wasp? They said, oh yeah. So gave it a quick rinse and popped it in a specimen tube, and sure enough, they brought it home and pinned it carefully, and they've got it identified. I was very disappointed, thinking that if it was a new species to science, we could call it Rhinosulus. for flying up my nose. But no, it's not a new species for science, but it is a new record for San Benedicto Island. There were some other really interesting insects on San Benedicto Island, including this little guy who's a parasite on frigate birds. So it really gives you some insight into how some of these insects are getting here. They're hitching a ride on a lot of the birds. You know, our birds are flying out here, they've got parasites, they've got insects on them. Presumably some of the ants are getting here the same way. And there were certainly new ant records for the Revillagigedos too on San Benedicto again. And not just native ants, but also non-native ants that could potentially be disturbing that balance. Again, we don't know a lot about the impact of some of our non-native ant species, but here you can see one of each pictured. And if that's what got you really excited looking at all those pictures, you can always cool off with a beer named after the Revillagigedo Islands. So the Colima Brewery does a special beer series that are named after the Revillagigedo Islands. So there's a Roca Partida and an Everman named after the peak on Socorro, and a Pardola named after the peak on San Benedicto. So I highly recommend you drink a beer as you think about the Revillagigedo Islands from the Colima Brewery. And with that, I am going to leave you with a couple of last slides here. As I mentioned, that report is available online. This link is also in the comments box here on the webinar. It does include chapters on ornithology, birds, botany, plants, entomology, invertebrates, herpetology, reptiles and amphibians, malacology, shells, vegetation of the different islands. I would encourage you to go ahead and download that. This is a picture of the front cover. And with that, I'll just leave you with, this is just an excerpt from the beginning of the report. The new records from this expedition alone total more than 76 taxa. You can see the breakdown there. And in many cases, these new records elucidate the global distribution patterns of these species and provide opportunities to learn more about their abundance and behavior. Just kind of echoing the words at the beginning that Ezekiel gave us there. And we will leave the land of red crabs and blue lizards, which I loved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sula.